to where I was before. All right, here we go. And then, Annie, I will add you to the list. Okay, so we've got president, we've got the recorded meeting. So one of the things I wanted to bring up, although it looks like we ended up with good attendance today, is if we wanted to establish a quorum. We have a fairly large group, and sometimes not all of us will be available for the standing meetings. Again, not necessarily something we have to decide today, but I wanted to put it out there. I'm open to suggestions on if we just want it a simple majority or a given proportion, just so that we could continue discussions as we meet twice a month, even if not everyone is able to attend. Are there any thoughts on that anyone would like to share?
Good idea. Cannot wait for everybody. I think, yeah. Finish. Yeah.
Yeah. Does anybody have experience? I know lots of people do, what is it, the Roberts laws, but I think that's basically just a proportion. So I'm open to other experiences that you may have with other meetings. Otherwise, I propose we just do a simple majority. So if at least more than half of us are here, we'll meet. Good. Okay. So I hope that. So I just took the key points that we talked about at the last meeting of things we might want to do for our OKRs. As we've discussed, I think we want to try to come up with goals that are things we can do in the year. Lots of times people throw in one extra sort of, be really awesome if we can get this done, but we're not necessarily sure we'll get that far. So we'll probably have multiple conversations on what we think is obtainable. But these are basically bullets from our past discussion. And I put a couple on top that I think are probably higher priority for discussion. One that came up a lot in our discussion last time is kind of working backwards from the end result. So what is it we would like this committee to achieve, and then kind of look at what the steps are we need to do to get there. We could even particularly have articulating that as one of our objectives and key results. I also included a mission statement because that kind of ties into it. Like, what is it we want to achieve as a working group is defining a mission statement. Sometimes they can be more vague, just as what the group plans to do, not just in this year, but in the future, or sort of reasons for existence of the group or long-term goals. But I wanted to add that. And then the rest of the items are things that will compose the other two. So, defining use cases, building a vocabulary, the landscape analysis, all these things that we are likely to need to do to get to the end result and fulfill our mission. So I'm open to starting with trying to define our end result and then building on from there, but I'm also open to suggestion. So anyone, I guess, want to start or add on?
Nicole, just a question. Is this working because you are part of the OMOP sort of organization? Is that an official working group within OMOP, or it's just like us and more informal?
Yeah, so
are there any procedures we need to follow, or? Yeah.
So we are official, although I don't know that they're meeting rules per se. So there are many working groups. Working groups kind of come up or proposed as um, needs arise. So, for example, that there's now new this year is a large language model working group, and things like that, or working groups within specific disciplines to improve the vocabulary for those disciplines. So they are kind of arising at proposed as needed. For the survey sub-working group, we're a sub-working group of the Common Data Model working group. And basically, this is sort of a slot they've wanted filled, but nobody's been willing to take it on so far in a holistic way. So I didn't have to propose that we do the working group. It was something that they wanted. And then I'm just kind of mirroring the processes that we do through the CDM working group. But I don't know that there's a formal like bylaws of working groups kind of document.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we had to produce something along the lines you were saying that will define us as a group, what is our mission, and then there would be kind of part of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is transparency and documentation. And so I need to again check my email because I've been gone to see where we are on this. But OMOP is giving us a GitHub under the OMOP organization. Okay. So we won't be nested under the CDM. We'll have our own GitHub, I guess, space within probably repo within the OMOP organization. So I think the transparency is a big part, so that we're sharing our minutes, the recordings, the meetings, and then other things we develop as we go through this process. But thank you for asking. That was a good question. Anything else along those lines, or anywhere we want to start digging in? I think everybody's feeling as awake as I am this morning. Operating on coffee. All right, let me go back to our list. Okay, so we'll start here. So I guess in a ideal world, what I see the end result for this is a way, to improve the ability to map survey data to OMOP, and to provide tools that either add to tools that are in the CDM, or create new tools that are necessary to do that. And I think two of the things that we really need to get to that point include fleshing out a vocabulary so that we can encompass as high a resolution as possible for the types of questions that are answered in the survey. So, for example, providing necessary groupings of age ranges, or race ethnicity, or gender, things like that are not necessarily already defined through the current vocabularies, including things like LINC and SNOMED and things like that. So I think what that leads to is having what they refer to as an expansion table for OMOP. So it would be a vocabulary and basically a vocabulary extension table. So that's what I would like us to be able to get to. I do think they're useful products that we can produce in between. But from my perspective, I view that as the end goal. We've also talked about having that best practices or a guide to go with those products when they're produced. So I'm including that. Does anyone else have a different vision of what they think the end should look like, or additional goals or things we would want someone being able to, working with survey data, to be able to do with OMOP?
I'm curious about the vision for building the vocabulary. So what would be the idea or the way we would need to work through what elements to include, or like how to source those elements? Yeah, I think that feels overwhelming.
I agree. It definitely feels overwhelming. And I think that's, there's going to be many steps to that end goal. I do think one of the first things, which I think is what Tamara had proposed at our first meeting, is going through and doing the landscape analysis. So seeing what else has already been done. So for example, we know all of us has a vocabulary that's part of Athena. That's, it hasn't necessarily been mapped, but it exists. We know their vocabularies that include things that responses from surveys that are part of LOINC and SNOMED. I think part of it is looking at what's out there, where it's kept, and think about how we can evaluate how to put them together in one place, and then determine what the gaps are. So the landscape analysis may be, other than setting up our OKRs and goals, maybe the first thing we really need to do, because it'll let us know where we are. Tamara?
Thanks. Yeah, I think as part of that, we should also look at the Phoenix toolkit, because that's an attempt. There have been other attempts to harmonize survey data, not in this type of common data model, but they've done a lot of work in sort of common data elements that are collected in surveys. And that might be a place where we can go, rather than this overwhelming, like try to map every survey question that's ever been asked by any cohort ever. That's like a more concrete set of things that we could maybe start with. And it's something that's already trying to be useful across cohorts and for harmonization across studies.
Did you put the link to that in the chat? Is it you said the Phoenix?
Yeah, I'll put it in the link.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I agree. It's really ambitious to say we're going to do every survey ever. That is a really, really good point. Thank you for that, Tamara, that resource.
I was thinking about that resource as well, because it seems like it would be really important for us to just prioritize the domains of interest we would have, and maybe do an analysis that way. But in terms of survey vocabularies in OMOP, I know UK Biobank and all of us have their own vocab, but otherwise, I think, there's probably a lot out there in LOINC that's mapped to a scale, but just starting how we would want to prioritize that feels important.
See?
Yeah. So I agree that thinking about starting to make vocabulary sounds not only overwhelming, but probably nothing that we all want to kind of spend our time coming up with vocabularies. But so I think building, as it was said, from where we are right now, what has already been done, will be very critical. And I think the reason why we are all here is because we all been trying to improve interoperability within our data and across our data sets. And we have people working with us that are maybe doing the kind of the groundwork necessarily, like the programming. So I think coming with some specific use cases of the problems we are addressing might be a very good starting point, rather than starting to build vocabularies and then using what's already out there and what are the blocks that we are facing. And then maybe that might be that we don't have that we need tools that we need. Hopefully the answer is not more vocabularies, because we can all create vocabularies, and then it's at the end is you have to link all of those. So we're getting more towards the concept of linked data and not very real. I mean, there are we could use some of the existing tools when you start exploring, because there are like thousands and thousands of vocabularies for medical terms. And so there are some of the tools that are being used to query, or some of the things that you'll be developing for Connect So I think for me, my point of view, coming with a concrete example, barriers that we are facing, and with this goal of improving interoperability of data, and then have some people that work with that, because who's going to be doing the work, right? Are we going to be, I think at the end, whatever in labs, people have to spend quite a bit of time, and I think we are here because we have people, or we are spending already the time, and then sort of how can we help each other, and then the community by extension. So I would just want to throw that to see how people think about doing that in a very practical way and addressing the problems that we all have, common problems, so we can help each other and then come up with something that will be useful for the community.
Yeah, and use cases are on the list of OKRs as well. So I think it's maybe just trying to triage what first steps have to happen. So, and there's some things we can do in parallel. I think it's reasonable. We could be, defining use cases while also doing a landscape analysis. Jim?
Yeah, thank you. I want to second what Mansi said. And to me, the second part of your bullet point I, you say, or define the value proposition. To me, that seems even more important. I think it could be its own OKR, because I think that addresses the other issue of why should a cohort or a project invest in this. And I think that's essential. As we do that, we'll also probably identify, Monsi, the high priority things that are worth pursuing. And then related to that, I know this would be a little bit unusual, but to me, it would be useful for us to track the accounting. How much time are we spending on this? What kind of skill sets are needed? How many people? Because what of the ideal end result would look, to me, what it would look like is, we could go back to the community in 10 months time, 9 months time, and say, look, here's this common challenge we've been facing, as Monsi said. Here's why a CDM helped us, and here's what it took to close that gap over 6 months, 9 months, whatever it is.
And just for clarification, Jim, are you meaning the resources that somebody would need to do the mapping for their cohort, or the resources that we're needing to do the work of the working group, or both?
I think the former would come from the latter. If we track what we're spending, time and energy, and the skill sets needed, then it would be straightforward to include that as one of our deliverables.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that what you said, Jim, in terms of if we are willing to put the time, that's kind of a prioritization. I think that's actually important, but we cannot. Otherwise, things are not going to happen unless it's something that we see the value for our cohorts. And if we see the value for our cohorts, then we're willing to put in efforts or time. And it will, I think, we are a very good representation. I think will then be helpful by extension for many others that haven't maybe been thinking about that. So I like the idea, Jim, that you're saying, of coming up with something and then maybe a timeline of where we want to be, sort of where we want to be, identify the problem, and then maybe some objectives, initially more shorter term rather than the very longer term, which we also need to put in the mission and vision, but break it down to concrete steps or objectives. Through these use cases of things that we think are the most pressing challenges.
Thanks, Muncie and Jim. Let me back to the list. So some of these are in here. So we've got defining the use cases, the build of vocabulary, which is part of the end mission, the landscape analysis, best practices, which I think we can also say can include these resources needed aspect. The platform I put sort of low-hanging fruit, since we will have that. and again, we go to our best practices guide or tutorial. So we've got several items on here that we've talked about that can be fleshed out. Is there anything you feel our working group should be tackling that's not in this list in some form already? Yeah, I agree. It's a pretty long list. Thanks, Tamara. Um, so all right, so I think we've got a good place to start off from. So it's going to be refining these items and kind of deciding on order. So maybe what we could talk about next then are the action items, sort of how we want to work on this from here. So what I would like to do is what I did before is take our notes, the transcript and flesh out our meeting notes. But also, are there anyone in the group who's currently working on issues in this or is invested enough in where their process is that they would want to contribute to developing the use cases? Because I think the combination of the use cases and starting the landscape are going to give us a lot of direction for what our um, goals, our deliverable goals are. So, is anybody who's in a place where that's something they are interested in doing, is defining use cases? It can be specific to their cohort or multiple cohorts that they've worked on. Any of the above.
Tom, do you want to maybe mention what we
Yeah, I
are
was
doing to start with the cohort consortium, which is a lot of this project, and having the data dictionary and then sort of mapping.
Yeah,
I mean, I
yeah,
think
that's
you've
what I
been
was
doing some of
thinking.
that.
Yeah, which I mean, like Nicole, you've been kind of roped into that a little bit too with the so with the I think most of I think people on this call are somewhat aware of like the project we have within the NCI cohort consortium of the breast cancer risk prediction project. So we have a common data dictionary that a little bit over 20 cohorts have been mapping to. So there's been a lot of discussion of harmonization efforts and common data models within this project. So I think that probably lends itself to be a good use case for some of this work.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, Tom. I mean, that was always a frustration with the cohort consortium, wasn't it? Which, for anyone who's not aware, is a set of predominantly cancer-based cohort studies that have been brought together kind of by the NCI, but still very much owned by all the PIs, and they're not really being much of a central infrastructure. And each time a new group was put together, even before the NCI cohort consortium, those consortium that came together and brought a lot of cohorts or case control studies together, there was always a big lift. And Fenix Toolkit didn't, at least at that time, resolve this, although maybe they've iterated over the last 10 years or more. For our future health, from our perspective, we're trying to just keep our hand in here to kind of see where this group is going and what they're developing and whether we can input on it. We haven't made any hard and fast decision yet on whether we're going to provide an OMOP version of our data set, but at some stage we probably will. It's just that with our model, we hope to be aligned with the FAIR principles, but probably less of an open system for sort of federated analytics, as OMOP has been used, but at least predominantly in Europe has been used for those types of analyses. So the value for us is really people being able to understand our data structure a bit more if they're very familiar with OMOP, as well as bring their code, albeit understand the level of granularity of any of the vocab or sub-vocabs that we would be able to try and align with based on whatever we do here for questionnaire data. And Magda, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, but kind of think we're at an early stage at the minute, but any further thoughts?
No, I think what you said makes sense. People being familiar with the format and being able to bring their code in. So yeah, don't have anything else to add.
Okay, so Tom, and this is something we certainly work on together. Would you want to flesh out some use case? Like, obviously, there's a larger use case of combining these cohorts um, for the breast cancer risk prediction, but also like things you might want to do with that data relative to EHR data or types of analyses, things like that. So we could flesh it out a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm absolutely. I'm happy to work on that. Yeah.
Great. And then anyone else would like to either work with Tom and I or have use cases from their own cohorts they would like to contribute?
So I guess what we all have cohorts with their own structure, and now Michael, you're now building one for our future health, and then you've been building one for Connect, and some of the others are much longer. So I guess one thing is the two scenarios when you start as a cohort from the beginning, that you may want to be organizing your data already with this thing in mind, that you may want to combine with others, and you want to think about your what you call intra-study interoperability. That is really relevant for new studies, but not only new studies, any studies that are collecting new data that you want to collect it maybe in a way that helps your within study interoperability. The example that Tom mentioned is about whatever, everybody has their own method, but now we want to pull the data together. The way we've been doing it is with the data dictionaries, and we redo it all the time. Can we do it in a way that it's more sort of reusable? So these are, in a sense, and you've defined that, I think, in your presentations, Nicole, so the between study interoperability, and we don't worry about how people organize their own data, but at the end, we want a whole map versus helping or working towards the more like intra-study interoperability. Should we focus on the latter? I mean, I know which one I said first, on the between study, but I think that could be also a very good forum for different studies to present how there are, how the data is being built, or how you're addressing the intra-study for studies interoperability. So that might be a good, so we could have a use case where it's a common long identified problem of having a common dictionary, and then maybe we can have another one that it's more about sort of how to, if you are starting from the beginning or you're including new data, what would be a good way to learn from each other, in a sense, initially, rather than having a use case for that. And then that could lead to a use case. Would that be helpful? I see this as they're related, but two different.
Yeah, I definitely agree they're related. And I also see it as something that could be part of the value proposition, like using these tools also, or moving towards a way of organization that helps with interoperability can also benefit your intraoperability, which is usually what people are dealing with first in trying to make that more efficient. So I definitely see it as something that would be part of a good part of the value proposition, where there are benefits early on to organize in a way that helps both with your internal management of the data and then your interoperability.
I don't know how helpful, but I worked on a work group similar to this a few years ago through a consortium with the CDC. And one of our goals was to identify a common data model that could be shared, very similar for these cohort studies at all. Ask very similar questions, but in different ways. And I think we actually spent so much of our time doing what was just spoken about, which was actually just comparing our data dictionaries, because it was so upstream. If you're not asking the question in the same way, then downstream, you really can't map it to the same variable. So if we are focusing on more of the downstream work, I think it's good just to at least maybe provide some guidance or make sure that's a limitation or consideration that's noted for researchers if they're not upstream asking the questions in a way that is represented in the vocabulary. I mean, it's not helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense, Brandy. as like, what can we, and again, it's more of an opportunity for studies that are newer, but if you're continuing, you ask follow-up surveys with similar questions, can you make changes that allow, future data to be more interoperable, and then, work backwards as needed.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's where something like the Phoenix toolkit could be particularly helpful, just looking at what a lot of the community already considers standard ways of asking certain items, because it's more likely they're using those. So if we're trying to add value through vocabulary, we probably want to have items or responses that are pretty standard.
Is there anybody, so it sounds like one of the things that might be helpful in our, in our next meeting or upcoming meeting would be to have some presentations on some of these things. So those of you who worked with the Phoenix toolkit, maybe walk the rest of the group for it, or Tom, for you to present on the BRCPP, like what's going on with that, just to give everybody, get us all sort of on the same page with how some of these things are working. Or I don't know, if we want to spend time with all of us talking a little bit about our own cohorts and kind of where we are in that continuum of operability and that, that kind of thing. But that might be helpful, to do some of that landscape surveying within just this group, so we all have a little bit better understanding of these cohorts.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think we have there's some 2 classes cohorts that have been running for a long time and it has been evolving. And then you have like 3 new cohorts that are doing things differently, connect all of us and our future health. So actually might be also good to demonstrate like the way you're doing that in Connect, or you're doing that in our future health using concept IDs, or you might be doing it in our future health. Does it make the job of the interoperability between these 3 cohorts easier than doing it, as you were saying, Mary, no, what's your name? Brandy. That when you are actually have the problem that the data was collected in many different ways, but it was basically when you're very downstream to the process versus when you're closer to the collection and you collected the data already in a way with interoperability in mind, versus when we collected like some data 20 years ago, and was very different. So that could be a good, having connect all of us and our future health, that could be in terms of presentations, to hear how you are structuring the data, and then have a use case to see, is it now easier for all of you to combine data than the breast cancer research project that's dealing mainly with historical data.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'm definitely interested. I know a little bit about all of us, but I know the least probably about our future health. So I'd definitely be interested in seeing the process for other cohorts. And certainly happy to share, what we've been doing with Connect, and, what's helpful and what we're still struggling with or need to do differently. Mara or Brandy, would you be willing to talk about the Phoenix toolkit and your experiences with that?
And I think, Tamara, I think you had also just messaged me to see maybe it might be helpful just to share about how AOU just sources instruments in general. I think that these are just limitations or considerations that are so far upstream that even if there was a perfect vocabulary, something to think about.
Can do that. So so potentially for the next meeting, we could spend part of it refining what we've discussed. So like I said, I'll take notes from this meeting, and kind of keep refining our OKRs from it. Tom and I will work. We were meeting on Friday anyway, Tom, to talk about stuff for the pop science node. So we could maybe talk about this as well, and work on refining some of those. And then maybe go ahead and start with the Phoenix toolkit for the next meeting. So kind of half refining this discussion, half the toolkit. And then the meeting after that, we could have presentations from Connect, all of us, and our future health. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, so that sounds good. So I'll list those as our action items for next time. I will share out the information about our repo once I have it. And then that's where we'll start keeping the meeting minutes and the meeting recordings. I don't think there's anything left on the list we haven't talked about yet. Is there anything anyone wants to touch on before we close? All right. Well, I think we're at a good stopping point. I don't feel the need to meet an extra 18 minutes. We don't have to use the hour if we don't need it. I'll write up, like I said, I'll write up the notes, and we'll plan on continuing to refine the OKRs and look into the Phoenix toolkit when we meet in 2 weeks. Well, thanks everybody for starting your
Thank you,
week.
Nicole.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Nicole.
All right.
Thanks,
Have a great
bye.
week. Bye.